Welcome to GS podcast number 115. How the hell are you? Good? Good? I'm very pleased to be bringing you a conversation I had with Josh Zepps. I really like Josh. He's great. You may have seen him. He's an Australian TV and radio presenter. Really interested in having detailed discussions about complex issues and handling it in a way that's not led by outrage or any overt political agenda. He seems genuinely interested in picking things apart and seeing what the truth is under there. Now, I've listened to his stuff for a while now. Many of you may already listen to We the People Live, which is his podcast. I'd highly recommend that, wtplive.com. So we managed to cover a whole host of issues, right through American politics and gun control, to animal welfare, to sacred cows and taboos, things you can and can't say. And I really enjoyed it, and I suspect you'll enjoy it too. So let me know what you think. Let Josh know what you think. Send him some love. Send him some feedback. Send him some kind words. You can find him on Twitter at Josh Zepps. That's Zepps. And make sure you check out We the People Live and listen out for various other projects that Josh is involved in at the end of the show. He seems a very busy man. You can keep up to date on this very podcast at gspellchecker.com. Enjoy.
There's a word that some folks find real hard to spell. Ain't it horrible for me, except after seeing who cared to go burn in hell? But then along came a man, a spell checker from the God of Creed, and he set out upon a noble quest to help those who don't know what it means. And he said, it goes A-C-H-E-I-S-T, and don't you put that I before that E. A-C-H-E-I-S-T, don't mean we know, just means we don't believe. And he keeps telling them things the godless say. A reason shoppers at night will make them run away. But if it's not that fight, well, they can go all day. Spell checker, he's a god, spell checker. Now you know how it goes, so sing along with me. A-C-H-E-I-S-T, A-C-H-E-I-S-T, A-C-H-E-I-S-T.
I'm very pleased to welcome, for the first time, Josh Zepps to the Godless Spell Checker podcast. Hello, sir.
Hello, mate. It's a great pleasure to be here.
Pleasure's all mine. How are you?
Good. It's a little bit early here in Australia, but I've got 6-month-old twin babies, so early doesn't mean anything to me anymore. I've lost my mojo. I've lost my ability to distinguish late night from early morning from noon.
Have you started seeing Jesus yet?
I think I would have to be very, very, very tired to start seeing Jesus. Like hobgoblins, ghouls, and demons, maybe, but Jesus is like down the very end of the list.
That's good
of
to hear.
hallucinations.
Maybe you could, I imagine there's a lot of my listeners listen to We Are the People Live, but for those who are not familiar with what you get up to, how would you describe what takes up the bulk of your time?
Well, at the moment, I'm working mainly for ABC Radio in Australia, but the way that most people will know me, who are your listeners, is probably from my podcast, We the People Live, which I've been doing for a few years. I lived in New York for the past 12 years, basically, and I was working for HuffPost Live over there. I was one of the founding presenters and producers of that between 2012 when we launched and 2016 when it ended, and that was basically 12 hours a day of television conversations about what's going on in the world with newsmakers and celebrities, and kind of looping in listeners and viewers to join us live via webcam and on social media and all that kind of, yay, it's the 21st century, what the hell are we going to do with the media kind of thing. And while I was there, I thought I should probably just start doing a live podcast show where interesting people gather together in a bar in Brooklyn and talk about the week's news, and we can have people there drinking cocktails and asking questions and chiming in. And I just sort of really launched it as a sandpit to try to figure out what the next incarnation of having smart, funny conversations about things that are important might be. And it gained a life of its own. It quickly rose up the iTunes charts, and it's hit the number one spot on the comedy chart on iTunes a number of times. And it became too difficult for me to do the logistical lift of having a live show in Brooklyn every week, or even pretty much every month. And so I started experimenting with just having sort of Skype conversations with interesting people the way that you do and the way that a lot of podcasts do. And the listener numbers didn't seem to diminish, whether or not I busted my ass going out to a bar in Brooklyn in the middle of a snowy night, inviting big comics to come and talk about the news, or whether I just happened to sit down and talk to someone interesting on a computer in my basement in my underwear. So I thought, stuff this, I'll just do the latter. Why would you bother doing the former? So now it's a bit of a hodgepodge. Once a month we have a live show still. But in general, I try to just have interesting conversations. So that's that's spelled with a hashtag in front of it, and We the People is all one word if people haven't heard the podcast and want to go and check it out. But yeah, basically I'm a broadcaster, journalist, conversationalist, talky, thinky person, now on mainstream radio in Australia as well. The ABC is sort of Australia's BBC for your British listeners who don't know it.
Excellent. So a lot going on. I mean, there is a lot to be said for the old remote Skype conversation. I mean, I'm sat here in my Batman dressing gown, which is, it's always a good day for me when I get to do that.
You're in the Batman. I'm in the Superman. It's amazing.
We should probably fight each other now. So, I mean, I mean, it's a very interesting idea, that recording in a bar, and especially interesting introducing alcohol into the mix when you're having a conversation and recording it. Is that something you'd recommend in general when you're having political conversations?
It depends. I think the conceit of alcohol is actually more useful than the reality of it. By which I mean, I also had a segment on HuffPost Live every Wednesday afternoon at the end of the day called Cocktail Chatter with Josh Szeps, and it was sort of the same thing as We the People Live, but just televised. And it was a chat show in which we'd get three people to talk about the news. And I think just the hook of saying that we're going to be having cocktails and actually making cocktails for them changes the way that people think about the conversation. One of the hardest things in broadcasting, which I am going to guess that you probably know, is to get guests to get their defenses down a little bit and to talk to you as if... Like, quite often I'll find, I don't know if you've had this experience, but I'll find I'll be on a television show or I'll be hosting a television show or a radio show, and we'll get off, and in the green room afterwards or at the bar afterwards where we're catching up with the guests, I'm like, well, why weren't you just talking like this? Why don't we have this conversation on the air? Why is it so hard to get people to ignore the fact that there's a camera or a microphone and to speak candidly and openly about the things that they're really passionate about, and to argue with each other and to jump in and to interrupt each other and to behave like fucking human beings instead of like those robotic automatons who fill our screens and our airwaves? And so I wanted to and so when you ask about alcohol, I think alcohol is an easy shorthand that everyone understands to say, this is not a normal show, behave like yourself, not like you on TV.
Interesting psychological primer there, I think. It's interesting what you're saying about the people behaving differently when the camera's on them, because I think the nerves plays into it a lot, or they might expect to be under attack at any moment. And I think I decided when I launched the podcast that I'd have people on and we'd have conversations, and if we disagree, we disagree. But I didn't want to make it a debate format, constant, point scoring. You think this, I think this. I've got to win the argument, kind of thing. And I was wondering how valuable you think that conversation is, them kind of debates versus just general long form conversations.
That's a good question that I haven't thought very much about, because when I think about the debates that I really love, that work really well, when you watch old videos of Hitch or some other great Christopher Hitchens or some other great debater, I probably don't need to explain Hitch to your audience.
Peace be upon him.
Peace be upon him. When you see him eviscerating some fascist cardinal in some intelligence squared debate, there's just nothing gets the loins stirring better than that. But you're right that it probably throws more heat than light, and probably just fires up the bases more than sitting down and having a conversation was. So I wouldn't really poo-poo either one. What I would poo-poo is what has come to be called debate or controversy, or even allowing both sides to have their time. And this gets looped up into one of my pet peeves, which is the media's obsession with supposed even-handedness, which I think has gotten a little bit better since Donald Trump has been elected, in the States at least, because they've realized how the major media institutions like the Washington Post and the New York Times have realized that they dropped the ball in maybe the decade or so prior to the election of 2016, where by insisting that the correct posture for a journalist is to have no opinion about anything, including the truth, and simply to sit in the middle and allow the two sides, whatever those two sides believe, to hash it out. I think that's the kind of phony debate that maybe you're alluding to, where nothing is gained by... Al Franken used to say, in the context of climate change and the way that the media would report climate science, by having one climate scientist on to argue the case for climate science, and then they would have a a climate denier on the other side. And Al Franken would say it's a bit like doing a story about like childbirth and the development of babies. And on the one hand, you have a gynecologist obstetrician, and on the other hand, you have someone who believes in the stork delivery theory of babies.
Yeah, sure.
and you're like, I'm just impartial. I'm just sitting in the middle. You let the viewer decide. Like, that's not journalism, and that's not debate.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think obviously people misunderstand what it is to be objective sometimes. I think you can make arguments for one thing or the other in an objective manner. Even if you are making a position known, if you do it objectively, I think that's valid under the guise of journalism. I was just thinking, you're someone who originally hails from Australia. I think before we started recording, you said you first moved out to New York in 2005?
Yeah, that's right. Between 2004 and 2005, I wanted to be a journalist, broadcaster. I was always into comedy, and I'd done a lot of improv comedy, but I just felt like becoming a stand-up was just too thankless. And my heroes were Jon Stewart and Dave Letterman and Ricky Gervais. So I moved to New York mainly just to train at improv comedy, and secondarily because I loved New York and thought it would be a great place to spend my 20s in. And also just felt like there'd be more experience in broadcasting and television and radio there than there would be in a medium-sized market like Australia or even like the UK. And just found myself sort of falling on my feet there and loving it and falling in love with the city. And more than a decade passed and I was still there. I didn't leave until the spectre of family and children and babies and my 40s loomed.
Well, I mean, you shows a really like a eclectic mix of discussions, but I mean, one of the things you really touch on as well is the goings on in terms of the American political scene. It's become unavoidable, I think, for most countries to ignore what's happening in America at the minute. And I was wondering, coming from somewhere so far away as Australia, and then looking in almost as an outsider in a sense. Do you think that gives you some sort of unique perspective that might not be being shared if you was sort of completely native?
Yes, I do. It's funny, Stephen, that you say Australia's so far away, because although geographically it is on the other side of the planet, Australia gets a lot of its cultural input from the US and UK. Like, it doesn't feel... Have you been to Australia?
I've not, but I do have plans to go this November for the first time. I have family there, obviously. We all have family there.
Oh, fantastic. Great. I mean, I'll be interested to hear what you think, because I suspect you'll find it more familiar than you might think it is. So, but in terms of the impact on understanding US politics, I can't tell you what a bloody relief it is to no longer be inhaling the US news cycle 24 hours a day now that I'm spending more time outside of the States. It's really corrosive and toxic. In fact, one of the reasons why I decided to take the family away from the States at this juncture was I didn't think it would be healthy for my head to have that orange man in it every single day, like for the next 4 or 8 years. I just didn't think and I don't think it's healthy. I think Americans are collectively somewhat losing their minds at the moment about it. It's a little similar, although not quite so bad in the UK with Brexit. When you just think about the amount of oxygen that this conversation has consumed over the past 2 years. Like, think of the wasted, squandered conversations that could have been had about Britain's priorities that have not taken place because of all the hoo-ha about Brexit. I mean, quite apart from what you think about Brexit in and of itself, it's just an enormous kind of almost psychological and emotional and spiritual tax that's being imposed on everybody. And I feel the same way about Trump. On the question of specifically, does my non-Americanism give me insight into America? I think it does. I think it can't help but. And not so much about US politics, but about noticing sacred cows that other people don't notice. I think anyone who's lived in a number of different countries has a good ability to perceive the differences between the things that those countries take for granted that they don't realize they're taking for granted. So there are some things in the States, like, for example, it's reflexive reverence for the military, that even people on the left who find it problematic what the Pentagon is doing and America's history of war and didn't support the war in Iraq and didn't support Vietnam, have a problem with the military-industrial complex. There is still a genuflection towards the notion of the honorable soldier, and that being something that you need to sort of revere, that I don't find in Australia. I'm not familiar enough with it in the UK to speak to it, but there are little things like that and their attitude towards guns and the healthcare debate and so on that I think it would be very hard to have my insight into if you'd been born and raised inside of the soup. It reminds me a little bit of the old gag about the two young fish who are swimming through the ocean, and an old fish swims past, and the old fish says to them, "How's the water today, boys?" And the old fish swims away, and the two young fish swim on for a bit, and then one of them turns to the other one and says, "What's water?" Like, when you're in it, you don't, the Americans just live in their own water, and you can't get out of it to notice it.
Yeah, well, that's a great. I mean, you made some great points there about the saturation of Trump and Brexit. It's almost making good people just disengage because it's constant and it is. I think you use the word taxing, which is I think is spot on. But talking of sacred cows and dogmas and almost national religions, the Second Amendment there's a perfect example. And I'm glad I've got you on this topic actually, because after Florida happened a couple of weeks ago, we reignited the usual cycle of gun debates and NRA posturing, and I'm sure you've seen that over and over again whilst you've been in the States. And one of the things that comes up constantly about this debate is Australia, strangely, and the way they responded to a gun massacre. I think it may have been 96, you can correct me on this. I think they launched a buyback scheme. That's right. And I think over 600,000 guns were taken out of circulation. And people will invoke this bit of knowledge to try and say this is something America could do to correct their system, and I'm not entirely convinced it's like for like, but I'd be very interested to hear what you think about that.
Yeah, so guns are interesting. In fact, I did an unusual episode of my podcast. I think it's episode 114, which is just me sitting down in front of a microphone and unleashing about guns, because it's very difficult to speak to people on either side of this issue and in a way that doesn't immediately alienate them. I encourage people to listen to that. I got a lot of great feedback about it, and I think it's unusual to hear somebody who isn't particularly hyper-partisan on either side, who sort of has enough lived experience of being around people who are both very pro-gun and those who are very anti-gun to be able to articulate both sides in a way that each side would agree with. Australia's experience is, I don't think, particularly useful to the United States in terms of banning semi-automatic weapons, because I just don't think that's likely to happen in the US. But what people don't understand about Australia's experience, and as you say, it was 1996, there was a mass shooting in which more than 30 people were assassinated by a gunman using a semi-automatic weapon in Port Arthur, which is a historic tourist village in Tasmania. And the Conservative Prime Minister, John Howard, decided that this would be a moment early in his term to assert himself, I suppose, as a strong leader and to defy the direction that the United States had taken and implement wholesale gun law reform. What people seem to think is that Australia banned guns and that now there are no guns in Australia. In reality, there are more guns in Australia now than there were before the gun buyback. So the gun buyback's what everyone focuses on. More than 600,000 guns were forcibly bought back by the government. They call it a buyback, but it's not really a buyback. It was a confiscation, and you were given money to compensate for the fact that the government was stealing your guns. But you were still able to... What it basically did was say that self-defense is no longer a reason to have a gun, but you can have a gun for hunting and you can have a gun for sportsmanship. You just can't have certain classes of guns. But what really changed was not the number of guns. It wasn't the buyback itself. It was the regulations that were imposed about your responsibility for your own firearm and the government's ability to track firearms. So in the States, you can basically do anything with your gun, including lose it or give it to someone else without committing a background check against them, or sell it to someone else without any kind of background check and without informing the authorities. Which means that you've got a nation that is just awash with guns and nobody knows where they are or what they're doing or who's got them. In Australia, the main reform, as I understand it, is that it became a crime it became a crime to lose your gun and not report it to the cops. And it became a crime to sell your gun without a cop witnessing that sale. You could sell it to a registered gun dealer, but if you were going to sell it to anyone who's not a registered gun dealer, you had to go down to the police station now and you have to have a cop witness it. Then there are a whole bunch of boring regulations that I won't get into about the tracking of firearms. And suffice it to say, there hasn't been a single mass shooting since 1996, touch wood, in Australia. And the level of gun homicide, I think, is about 25 or 30 times lower than in the United States. And actually, one of the big unexpected benefits of gun law reform has been the dramatic drop in suicides. Because even if you're a gun nut who thinks that, look, bad people are going to do bad things regardless of whether or not they have a gun. If you don't have a gun, then they're just going to use a hammer. If they don't have a hammer, they'll use a knife, whatever. What you can't deny is that if you're in the darkest moment of your life and you're drunk and alone and you have a gun, you are much, much, much more likely to kill yourself with that gun than if you don't have a gun and have to do it some messier way. So suicides in Australia, I think, have declined by I don't have the stat in front of me, but I think about 60% since before then.
Right, that's a very interesting stat. So, I mean, I kind of feel with America in that sense that I'm very pessimistic, and I kind of feel like the horse has already bolted on this argument for them. And I was wondering if do you have much more of a positive outlook in that respect? Do you see any way back from this madness?
No, not at all. No, I'm with you. I think that it's way too entrenched in. I mean, I've spent enough time in the South and the Midwest and the West in America to realize. I mean, my in-laws have guns in the house. They live in New Hampshire. The state motto is "Live free or die." That's what it says on the bumper stickers. They're lovely people. It's a tolerant, progressive-minded state, but it's a libertarian kind of part of the country. And in those parts of the country, the idea of the government intruding on something that they regard as just being sort of a tool that they've never done anything wrong with, and nobody they know has ever done anything wrong with, simply because we get all excitable about these big, rare kind of news events when someone walks into a school and shoots it up thousands of miles away from them. They just think that just smacks of overreach in a way that it doesn't to Australians and Europeans. And I don't think you're going to get that. You're going to iron that cultural bias out of Americans anytime soon.
Yeah, it's scary. I mean, you're talking there about suicide as well, and that it's obviously with the gun in the house that is significantly increased. And I always wondered as well. I wonder how many times couples have just pulled guns on each other in the heat of an argument. I reckon that's quite a common occurrence in America, that a gun gets pulled far more frequently than someone gets shot. But I mean, just to have that in the mix in any situation around humans and have it so easily accessible, I think it just seems mental to everyone on the outside looking in, and it's fairly depressing, really. I kind of love America, and this one blip seems to be like a major issue, and I don't think there's any way back from it.
I mean, I should also say that depending on the survey that you look at, somewhere between 70 and 90% of Americans favour some kind of gun safety reform. The most common proposal being to close what they call in the jargon the gun show loophole, which is basically what I was just talking about, which is the right of people to sell guns without conducting background checks on people. So fixing the background, and it's called the gun show loophole because you can go to a gun show and you can buy a gun off a non-registered, non-gun dealer, and they don't have to perform a background check on you to check that you're not crazy or a criminal. And most guns are bought that way. Most guns are not bought through licensed dealers, I believe. So, a lot of Americans are in favor of these kinds of reforms, but this is one of those interesting scenarios where the people who oppose reform just care so much more about it than the people who are in favor of reform. We see this again and again in politics, and it's one of the reasons why I think people are frustrated with democracy at the present time. That you can see it on climate change. You see it even on something like Brexit, where if 10 or 20% of the population feels very, very, very strongly about one thing, and that's the number one thing that they care about, and they're going to change their vote and literally not vote for a local representative who disagrees with them on that one issue, but 80 or 90% of the population opposes them on that, but it's sort of their fourth or fifth most important issue, and they're not really necessarily going to vote a representative out of office simply because they disagree with them on it, then you're in a bit of a bind. That 10 and 20% just have much, much more power to sway the opinions of their elected representatives than the other 80 or 90% do, because that for the other 80 or 90%, it's just one of a number of issues.
Moving on to something a little more cheery, I suppose, then. What I like about what you do as well, not only do you have conversations on big topics with quite a diverse bunch of people, but you're also engaged on how to have the conversation as well. You speak a lot about things that impede conversation, ways of behaving that either contribute or detract from things. And I was wondering how you feel social media has impacted the general discourse. It's been great in the sense that we're all journalists in a way. We can report, we can be first to the scene of something, we can share truth and expose things, but it can also be used for very nefarious things and character assassinations and smearing and fake news. I know you've touched on a bit, and I was just wondering how you navigate the cesspool of places like Twitter and various other social media outlets.
Well, it's tricky, isn't it? I mean, I think anyone who's on it and who spends time on it has a conflicted relationship with it for so many reasons. I mean, there's a whole other conversation that we can park for the moment about the impact that it has on our brains to be constantly distracted by, rewarded by, pinged by Facebook and Twitter and social media companies who have geniuses working around the clock to try to figure out how to maximize your time on the site and how to stir up all of those hormones and emotions in you that are going to cause you to engage. That's a whole other question about the future of technology and civilization. But on the question of what it's doing to our conversations, I do think, I mean, the mission of my life is basically to find ways to have conversations with people that are inspiring and entertaining and thought-provoking and that leave bystanders to that conversation, if not the participants themselves, in a better position than when they went into the conversation. And I think social media is tearing away at that fabric because it's going in the opposite direction and it's corroding things. In fact, I think most of the media is. And I think the whole phenomenon of quote-unquote fake news has been enormously damaging to that. And so has, I mean, the left has its own culpability here, because I think identity politics has been terrible for that. I think the sort of the deplatforming of conservative speakers on university campuses in the States has been terrible for that. The identity politics, I mean, here's an example. I did an episode of my podcast with Sam Harris and Joe Rogan. And the two of them, I wanted to get the two of them together to have a conversation about how to have conversations about provocative things without alienating people. Because I think those two guys are really, really good at finding ways of talking about things and not giving a shit whether or not there's going to be blowback by people who intentionally take you out of context or are disingenuous. You know, we all know that, especially on social media, we live in an age where if you trigger a certain tripwire, I mean, if I, in passing conversation, talk about how terrible I think the word nigger is, I mean, the mere fact that I just said that word on your podcast will reliably lead to people accusing me of being racist.
Yes.
I mean, this will happen, right? This is going to happen. Right now, as people are listening to this, they are composing tweets to me saying that I'm racist for saying that the word nigger is a terrible, hurtful word that should never be used in anger against somebody. But the fact that I said nigger instead of saying the N-word triggered a tripwire that in our cultural moment says it doesn't matter what is in Josh's heart at the moment. It doesn't matter the message he's trying to convey. He said a magic word, and because it's magic and because he's a white guy, all bets are off, and we can impugn his motives and we can slander him and we can drag him through the gutter and we can get hysterical on social media. So I wanted to have a conversation with Sam Harris and with Joe Rogan, so I got them together in Los Angeles. I was spending a lot of time there last year. And it just so happened that we were recording at Joe Rogan's studio, and Hannibal Buress, who's a great comic, an African-American comic, was in the studio having just done Joe's show. And Joe said, "Why don't you just stay?" And Hannibal was drunk. I mean, they had been drinking through Joe's show for 3 hours, and he was smashed. And I recorded for about 3 hours, released it as 2 separate episodes. People should check this out. I can't remember the exact episode number, but if you search for hashtag We the People, Sam Harris, Joe Rogan, Josh Szeps, you'll get it. And Sam Harris had wanted to make a point about Black Lives Matter. The point inflamed Hannibal Buress, the two of them got into a completely heated and unproductive argument, which was heated and unproductive about the topic that they were talking about, but totally productive to the point that I was trying to make, which was that it's impossible to have controversial conversations about sensitive subjects without triggering tripwires that set people off and lead in completely unproductive areas. So, like, that is highly entertaining, and I deeply encourage people to listen to it, but for all of the wrong reasons, for the very fact that it failed in doing what I wanted it to do, which was to be a conversation about how to have controversial conversations. And this comes up all the time in my life. You just put a call out on Twitter about things that you should talk about to me, and I was just flipping through it this morning, and you got more than one tweet asking me to explain why I think that I should kill why I think small babies should be killed.
Yeah.
This is another thing that I said on Joe Rogan's show on another occasion that I'd been on his show, right? The last time I was on his show, we were having a conversation about how difficult it is not to get people angry when you talk about sensitive subjects in an intellectual way. And specifically on this question of identity politics, how difficult it is to even be regarded as having standing to talk about certain things. Right? As a white person, you are basically no longer allowed to talk about anything to do with race. As a non-religious person, you are regarded as being an apostate if you talk about or stepping outside of your appropriate bounds if you talk about religion. As a straight person, you're not allowed to talk about gay issues. As a man, you're not allowed to talk about women's issues unless you're towing a very predictable line, and it's all about allyship in the way that the minority wants you to speak, right? And so on the question of abortion, I think I was simply making the point that, that's right, I think Joe had said that that men should not be involved in any way in legislating about abortion because abortion is about women's bodies. And I said, that's begging the question in like a traditional philosophical sense of that term. In other words, that's using in your argument the thing that it's your duty to set out to prove. What it's the pro-abortionists' job to prove is that abortion is about women's reproductive rights and their body and not about the rights of the fetus. So to say that that only women should be involved in conversations about abortion is to already cede the ground. I mean, you're just not going to get anywhere. This is going to be a conversation in which two people are talking on parallel tracks that never actually intersect. So I don't think it's reasonable to say that men shouldn't be involved in conversations about the legality or morality of abortion any more than it's reasonable to say that we shouldn't be involved in the legality or morality of conversations about torture or any other big ethical issue that we're all implicated in by being citizens of a demos where we're all supposed to have some kind of karmic moral responsibility for the decisions that we collectively make. And Joe completely didn't agree with that, was taking a hyper-feminist line saying that women should be the only people who make any decisions about abortion. And, I mean, this is a tricky thing to talk about as a guy, but the point that I was making was a fairly standard kind of utilitarian consequentialist position that if you want to understand it, just go and read some Peter Singer and you'll understand the position. It basically says both sides of the abortion debate don't make a whole lot of sense. The anti-abortionists say that the instant an egg gets fertilized, because it becomes a member of the species Homo sapiens and has the correct number of chromosomes and has a full set of DNA, it therefore has all of the attributes of personhood and all of the moral characteristics that it will have when it's a 20-year-old human being, and that it's just as morally evil to kill it at 5 days old when it's a 5-day-old blastocyst as when it's a 20-year-old human being. And then the other side of the argument, the pro-abortion side or pro-life side, pro-choice side as they like to be called, but I don't buy into that jargon, they will say that the act of excreting an infant out of your birth canal is what turns it instantly from a part of your body into a creature that has full personhood and full rights. That the exact same organism with the same level of development that's in the womb has no rights whatsoever, and that 3 hours before it's born, it's totally morally and legally legit to insert something into the woman and stab that infant in the head and crush its skull and drag its corpse out, and that's totally cool. But if you did it 3 hours later after it's out of the birth canal, then that is murder and you should be sent to jail forever. And I was saying that clearly there has to be some understanding that this is a graduated slope, and that unless you think that the mere act of being dependent, of the baby's being dependent on its mother, means that it doesn't have any rights, you should appreciate that my twins, who were born 4 weeks early, so my twins were born 4 weeks premature. A friend of mine has twins who were 8 weeks premature. Are we going to say that it makes moral sense that I could have morally and legally aborted, killed my own infants when they were 2 weeks older in terms of their development than my friends, just because they were still located in a womb and not out in the open? I mean, if I woke up from a coma, Stephen, and you were in a hospital bed next to me, and it turned out that I had a rare blood disease that only a few people in the world could give me a transfusion for, but it had to be a constant transfusion that lasted for months, and you were one of the people who could save my life, and we were lying there, I wouldn't regard it as being your duty necessarily to keep me alive, but I also wouldn't think that the fact that I'm dependent on you giving me a constant blood transfusion meant that I don't have a right to life. And similarly, I don't understand the argument that just because a baby is located inside a womb and is dependent on, I mean, after it's born, it's still dependent on your parents. Has any person who believes in the strict line of birth actually had children and seen how completely helpless they are when they're 1 week old?
Humans are rare in
what
that
do you
regard,
mean it's
yeah.
like... What do you mean it's autonomous when it's outside of the womb? So anyway, I was making these points and saying, within the context of saying, I think that it's morally problematic to kill any human life. I think abortion should be done rarely and safely. I don't regard it as being a cavalier form of birth control, especially since having kids and seeing the what do you call it when you put the little thing on the thing and you see the little photos of the babies in utero on the screen?
Ultrasound?
Yeah, that's right. Seeing the ultrasound, yeah. Especially after seeing that, the miraculousness of the whole thing just blows me away. And so I think that should always be done with a great deal of caution and a great deal of care and a great deal of moral gravitas. But legally speaking, do I think that a child that's born, for example, to somebody who for some reason didn't know that she was even pregnant. I mean, in my ideal world, there'd be free healthcare for everybody. Everyone would have great sex education. Everyone would have free contraception when they're in their teens. So the number of unwanted pregnancies would be almost nil. And when they did happen, we would be able to catch them well in advance. But should it ever be the case that a woman and her doctor had to make a tragic decision about an infant's life, then I was simply making the point that I don't think the moment of birth is particularly morally or legally relevant. I mean, you should sort of have some kind of developmental yardstick at which you say that, babies who are below the age of 12 months from the point of conception have less of a moral calculus in terms of what their parents can do to them than ones who are over the age of 12 months, or maybe you measure it developmentally or something. So I was just throwing around these ideas and being a little bit sort of I suppose, provocative in the way that I was saying them. And it proved, once again, just like the Hannibal, Joe Rogan, Sam Harris conversation, how bloody impossible it is to just have have what I regard as being sensible, grown-up conversations about things that people obviously, if they were to give me the benefit of the doubt, would, if not agree with, at least regard as being sane. But from thereafter, I mean, just the predictable litany of, I can't wait until I can get my hands on Josh's twins so that I can crush their skulls and kill them and see how he feels about killing babies, which he thinks is okay. And then even Joe had Hannibal Buress back on his show, and the two of them were talking about how bizarre it was that Josh went on this rant about killing babies. I mean, has anything that I've just said in the past 4 or 5 minutes, if anyone has listened to that and thought that it means that I think that it's totally cool to kill babies, then you're just off in cloud cuckoo land. You're just not mapping onto what words actually mean or giving me any kind of the benefit of the doubt. And that, in terms of, this is a very long-winded way of responding to your question about conversations, that is what we have to get over. We have to start being able to converse with one another in a way that gives each other the benefit of the doubt, that is somewhat generous, and that busts out of these partisan talking points where we feel like we have to oppose any sounds that someone is making that don't exist within our agreed-upon bubble. Like, listen to what I'm saying, have a conversation about what I'm saying, retaliate with good reasons, And if we can do more of fostering of those kinds of conversations, then hopefully we can stanch the tide against the barrage of bullshit that's coming from everywhere else.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think you're just guilty of thinking out loud there, really, and on a topic that's become very binary. I'm what you'd consider pro-choice, but I think there are grey areas. I think there's a lot of dogma on either side. I think people make that argument very easy for themselves. Just touching back on what you were saying before about the N word, I loathe that expression. I've started saying the nigger word now just to see if people notice instead of the N word, and I even do the air quotes. The nigger word. But I mean, in a sense, you grew up in a
that's good. I might take that on.
They don't notice sometimes. It's great. But I mean, given our different upbringings, I mean, obviously it's not considered polite to use that word, to say the least, in England, but it doesn't carry the same sort of weight as it does in the States for obvious reasons. I think that's probably true of Australia as well. So there's a little bit more wiggle room in terms of when you can say that word. But it's interesting what you said about that. Some fell out with some individual on Twitter a while back. He's blue tick. He calls himself a journalist, and after I kind of made him look silly for endorsing political violence, so he decided that I was a white supremacist overnight. And he to find evidence of this, he went through my tweets, and he found a discussion I was having with somebody about free speech. And my view on free speech is, well, anything goes. You should be able to say anything without fear of censorship, violence, state oppression, things like that. And he replied on this tweet, well, would you just go around saying nigger? He didn't say the N-word, he said nigger. And I replied with, well, you've just said it now. You've just said nigger, so it's not always racist. It depends on the context.
Right.
So I'm literally sending a tweet saying it depends on the context of the word, and he used a screenshot of this tweet to say clear evidence of white supremacy, which is really really interesting. So how do we have this issue where certain words are almost like magic spells to the point where, regardless of the context, people will just react to that one thing, and then it's game over as far as conversation's concerned?
I mean, it's not just words, Stephen. It's ideas. That's problem. That's the problem. We're getting grade inflation here, where we're inflating the number of things that are taboo to talk about. So, I mean, your analogy, your example there is perfect, right? He uses the word.
Yes.
Then he says to you, when should you be able to use it? You say it depends on the context, and he says that means that you're racist, even though the context in which he is using it is precisely what he would use to absolve himself of the charge of racism. And now there are whole positions that you're not allowed to take. I mean, I was, not to name drop, but last weekend there was a festival at the Sydney Opera House, and I was moderating this event with Fran Lebowitz. I don't know if she's famous in the UK, but she's a cantankerous old New Yorker who, hailing from the 1970s, writes very acerbic, funny essays in places like Vanity Fair. And I was asking her about the Me Too movement, about this kind of wave of women's rights in the wake of Harvey Weinstein and so on, and whether or not there was a risk of it going too far and prompting a backlash. And she basically said, that's just a fantasy that men like you have, because you want there to be a backlash because you want to suppress women, because that's what men do. And again, the idea of actually engaging with the intellectual content of what I was asking, instead of noting my penis and therefore making assumptions about what I was getting at, had gone. I mean, like I just feel like increasingly it's not just that you can't discuss the word nigger, you can't discuss the correct posture towards race relations. You can't discuss where the limits of satire begin and end.
You know how this is going to be portrayed, though, don't you? I mean, I can read the tweets already.
Of course.
Josh and Stephen complain about not being able to use the word nigger.
Yeah, that's right. Two white guys just dripping with their white privilege and crying crocodile tears about how sad it is that they can't go around disparaging minorities anymore like they used to in the 1950s. I mean, yeah, it's a pretty easy narrative to write. I can write it myself. Don't bother writing the tweets, people. I'll write them myself and I'll send them back to you. Mea culpa. I mean, when I encounter this too much, what I usually like to do is just find a couple of minority groups that I belong to, and then play the same identity politics card back to them. So, like, I'm married to a guy, so I can always pull the gay card. My dad was Jewish, so I can always pull the Jew card. So if people talk about how about my white privilege, I just look at them very sincerely and I say, I find your anti-Semitism and homophobia really offensive right now.
But do you not find, I mean, that's a perfect illustration of the hypocrisy of this sort of intersectional topping up, because they speak about how important these minority identities are, and they define whole swaths of people by these identities. Yet when somebody steps out of line, so say you're not the right, homo Jew, you're not the right kind of gay Jew, all of a sudden that buys you nothing. That currency cannot be spent anywhere. So it goes to show it's not about these identity traits. It's more about towing to a narrative.
Oh, I don't know, Stephen. I'm not sure that's true that it loses currency. I think we've gotten so rigidly obsessed with identity at the moment that it actually does have some currency. What doesn't have currency is my attempting to make have an intellectual conversation about a minority group that I don't belong to. But I do still think that it's just so bizarrely upside down and topsy-turvy, because what should be the case is, regardless of my identity or my gayness or Jewiness, the things that I say about a subject should be the determinant of whether or not I'm making sense or have standing or am full of shit. Instead, at the moment, I can make a perfectly cogent argument about why, for example, a joke that Stephen Colbert made about satirizing anti-Asian racists, which he made a few years ago, and I got into a lot of hot water by interviewing the activist, the hashtag Twitter activist, who tried to get Colbert fired for making the joke, and we were having a conversation about satire, and then social media blew up because here's this white privileged man talking down to a female of color about the limits of racial satire, right? The identities that I possess actually do have currency among those people, and if I were an Asian person making those same arguments, then there wouldn't have been the same backlash. So I don't know. I think there's just a double standard, and what minority group you happen to belong to does have currency, but you can earn that currency as a white man simply by buying into whatever allyship is defined as. This is one of the other exhausting things about our current cultural moment. The loudest voices in any given minority get to determine what the appropriate things that the majority should believe are.
Yes.
This comes back to not just race. So there's an orthodoxy in the United States about what it means to be a good ally of African Americans. And if I said the same things that many black intellectuals in the States say, who haven't drunk the groupthink Kool-Aid. So Camille Foster is a friend of mine who's at Freethink Media, who's a libertarian African-American guy. There are people like Glenn Lowry, John McWhorter, who writes for the New York Times and has a great podcast called Lexicon Valley. These are African-American intellectuals who frequently take issue with the African-American narrative as it's presented by, for example, Black Lives Matter. If they were not black, there's no way that they could say the things that they say, right? I mean, and that has some, I kind of understand that, because they have the lived experience and the credibility to be able to be part of the conversation in a way that an outsider doesn't.
Come for them with, coon, house Negro, that kind of thing.
Totally.
The same people
Uncle Tom.
Yeah. So, and that's usually a leftist, like the people, the fuzzy liberals who are saying that identity is important and we should protect these minority voices. They seem to be the ones that are most vicious when these minority voices step out of line. That's how it appears to me.
Yeah, and think about another issue that I know that you focus on is Islam, and the way that we are cowed by the loudest voices in religions as well. In order to be a good ally of Muslims, you have to parrot the kinds of sounds that get said by the loudest voices in the Muslim community, which tend to be the fairly homophobic and misogynistic authorities in that community. If instead you give a platform to people who are Muslim dissidents who've been able to escape that religion, then you're considered as being anti-Muslim or Islamophobic or whatever it might be. And this goes for every single minority. When I, as someone who's married to a guy, dispute some of the claims of the mainstream kind of LGBTQISTUV movement and say that maybe it's not all, for example, I think it's obvious that if you remove the taboos around dudes making out with each other, then some more dudes will be tempted to make out with each other, especially when they're in their teens and when they don't quite know exactly what they're doing. So that there is a criticism that, for example, the church could level towards people who are in favor of sexual liberation and gay rights, that to make it totally okay to be gay is going to lead to a greater amount of sexual experimentation. And the pro-gay lobby will just deny that. Will frequently say, that's not true, you're either born gay or you're born straight, there is no sort of grey area. I suppose there's a minority of bisexuals over here, but basically you can open the floodgates towards any sexual behaviour, and that's not going to increase that behaviour because we're all hardwired from birth to want certain things. I mean, I think anyone who truly interrogates their own fluctuating kind of sexual desires over the course of their life, especially in adolescence, will, if they're honest with themselves, accept that the cultural environments and constraints that were placed on them psychologically have some impact on what you feel you can or can't do without opening up a whole Pandora's box of identity questions. And that if you are able to date someone of the same sex and then date someone of the opposite sex when you were in your teens, and that didn't mean that you were flip-flopping in some way, and it didn't create a whole bunch of rumors among your peers about is he or isn't he, and is he in the closet or isn't he, that would probably change people's behavior. So, there are these sacred cows within my own minority communities that I speak out against, and that I don't understand why we are so afraid of confronting. It's the same with Jewishness. Like, when I stand up for the rights of Palestinians and when I criticize Israeli settlements, this idea that I'm being a bad Jew or that I'm a self-hating Jew because I'm critical of the Israeli state. I mean, give me a fucking break. Like, we have to get beyond this kind of thinking. We have to be able to just talk about ideas on their merits.
Yeah, I mean, tribalism plays a huge part, and I think harking back to social media, I think that's helped people form more tribes or invite more tribe members into their tribe. We've seen far more splits in ideologies than I think we may have 20, 30 years ago, just as a result of social media. I mean, I did want to ask you about the left in general. The left, they're a group of people, however I'm trying to collectively define them, that we've both been critical of in various ways. I regard myself as centre-left, actually, but I kind of feel like there's too many people letting the side down. And I always wonder with the hysteria and the deplatforming campaigns and the media picking up on this, and I wonder how much of a measure is it of the left? Is this representative of the left, all this hysteria and all this terrible behaviour, or is it being over-egged, or am I someone who's sensitive to noticing it because I'm on the left myself and I'm kind of looking out for it?
It's a good question, isn't it, Stephen? I don't know exactly. I suspect that it's being vastly overblown, and that most people on the left are still, on the broad left, are still sensible. But my fear is that as the extremes provoke each other, and I believe that in an election as close as the last presidential election in the States was, where all you were talking about was 70,000 votes in 3 Rust Belt states that tipped Trump over the line, in spite of getting 3 million fewer votes than Hillary Clinton. In an election that close, you cannot help but suspect that the incessant celebration of diversity and identity politics that the Democratic Party had been pushing might have alienated some white male industrial workers in the heartland. And the sense that nobody really gives a shit about decaying post-industrial towns, and that everybody gives a shit about the Muslim girl who stands up at the Democratic convention and gives an inspiring speech, about the woman, about Hillary Clinton and all of her friends at Davos who love to talk about how they're going to save the world, and all, like, there's something phony and bullshitty about the left's self-congratulatory, like, my shit doesn't stink, we're also fucking nice and fancy and kumbaya, that if that gave rise to Trump, then the Trump backlash and the hostility and that kind of coarseness that has unleashed is then provoking the left to hunker down and become even more deranged and more obsessed with identity politics and more obsessed with calling everybody who disagrees with them a white supremacist or a Nazi. And more obsessed with kind of fighting, with literally sometimes fighting or physically fighting people with whom they disagree, that I worry that just becomes two sides sparring with each other in increasingly hostile terrain. And so where does that leave the left? I mean, where does that leave, you call yourself centre-left, so let's talk about the centre bit of that. I think there's obviously a dearth of ideas. I mean, if you told an alien about Trump and you pointed out, and I'm using Trump as a sort of stand-in, it doesn't have to be Trump. You can translate this to, UKIP in the UK, or you can translate it to Marine Le Pen in France, or you can translate it to Alternative for Deutschland in Germany, or you can translate it to One Nation in Australia. These kind of populist uprisings. If you told an alien about what they're up to, and asked the alien, how best would you try to diminish that movement and find some kind of policy sanity in the midst of it? Surely they would say, well, look, these movements appeal to people who feel like they're disenfranchised, non-university educated people, mostly white people, mostly men. So wouldn't you talk about the ways in which those movements are not serving that portion of the population? Wouldn't you talk about the massive tax cuts that Trump has just passed? Wouldn't you talk about the fact that he doesn't actually give a shit about coal mining jobs, that it's all posturing, that he's basically playing an identity game and selling you up the river, that he's treating you as rubes, that the people who actually care about you not going bankrupt because of a medical bill are not the Republicans, but the Democrats? I mean, this conversation isn't happening. That's not the response to any of these movements. The response to these movements is to run around with your hair on fire talking about how bad racists are and how we have to defend minorities, but the only people who can defend those minorities are the minorities themselves because, allyship. And I mean, it's just exhausting. I think it's just the wrong approach. So when you say, where is the left? Like, I hope it's not much of the left that's engaged in all this, but I don't think it matters because the bit of the left that is engaged in all this is the bit that gets all the attention. Yeah, and the bit that
the representative,
the bit that defines the agenda.
Better or worse. I mean, yeah, it's amazing what you said about. I mean, it seems obvious to me that the failure of the left in many areas contributed to the rise of Trump, and you just felt when that happened, it might be a tipping point where the left would think, okay, we need to get our shit together here and have a think about the way we approach certain topics and get a grip of certain political issues that we've been neglecting and make more sense than the people on the other side. And like you say, it was a double, triple, quadruple down in calling everybody a racist, throwing around the term white supremacist, digging deeper into identity politics. And I suppose, I had a bet with somebody who told me Trump would be impeached before Christmas, so I won that easily. But I think the real bet is whether or not he's going to get a second term. Do you think this is likely?
I have no way of measuring it because I was wrong about his election.
Same.
I really didn't think that it was likely yeah. at all. Although, to my credit, I did write an article in the Australian Press in February or March of the election year saying, and it was entitled, Donald Trump definitely certainly can't win ... probably ? And I did say, it was saying that it is possible for him to win, but I was as bowled over by anyone. So when it comes to the next election, I think he'll run. I think unless Mueller has something extraordinary, which requires him to basically step down or face total and utter ruination in public, I think he'll run, and I think he could very well win. I think basically whether or not he wins is up to what we broadly on the left do and how we respond. If we respond by pointing out that he's passed a bunch of terrible policies that don't help poor people, although the tax cut in the short term does help poor people, it ends up hurting them in the long run after 10 years, but the Republicans have constructed it quite cleverly so that in the early years you get everyone gets a tax cut. So, but, if you find a way of trying to appeal to people's bottom line and you find someone who is a populist leftist candidate who doesn't have much truck with identity politics but talks about people's hip pocket issues, healthcare, sort of, I guess, what you want is a 40-year-old, sunny, white-toothed, blonde-haired, blue-eyed Bernie Sanders.
That's interesting.
Then I think that kind of populist could beat Donald Trump. But if you put up, a woman of color because she's a woman of color to go around talking about, how America is a nation of love, not division, then you're fucked.
Yeah. I've noticed you've done an episode on this idea of cultured meat, this artificial meat, lab-grown meat. It's got many different names, and you spoke a bit about animal welfare. And I like this topic's really important to me. I've not eaten any animals for about 6 years now, and I think I tend to feel that it was my skeptical approach that I applied to religion. We were talking about countries having systems, and you're not really quite seeing how dogmatic it is when you're actually in it. And I kind of felt the whole factory farming system and the relationship we have with our meat-based product fell into that category for me. So I kind of talked myself out of eating meat, and which is a shame, because I'm somebody who loved a steak. I'm kind of a self-hating vegan, to be honest. And I actually hate talking to vegans as well. I often joke that they're the kind of people that make me consider cannibalism, ironically. And I was pleased to see you putting content out on this artificial meat idea, and I think this is going to be a game changer, because I don't think we're going to get everyone to take a plant-based diet on board. I think it will take something like this to really impact agriculture and things like that. And I was just wondering where you are on this argument now.
Oh, I'm just the hopelessly guilt-ridden person who agrees intellectually with your position but doesn't have the fortitude to make the moral change in my own life yet. But good for you, Stephen. I'm glad that you have, and I admire that immensely. A few years ago, I became pescatarian. I figured that I didn't want to eat land animals and that I would try getting in that way. And I didn't really do it the right way. I lasted about a year. I put on a bit of weight because I was eating a lot of carbs. And basically fell off the wagon. I think I really do believe, especially having kids now, I think about, and if people are interested in this, it was really interesting talking to Paul Shapiro, who's the former vice president of the Humane Society in the United States, and who's just written this book called Clean Meat, which is exploring the future of lab-grown animal flesh that comes from creatures that don't have a brain, but it is nonetheless meat. It's not a vegetable product that's turned into something that tastes like meat. It's actual animal protein, and that's one of the recent episodes of We the People Live, if you want to look it up. I do think that it's likely that when my kids are my age, the status quo will have completely changed morally. And when I think back, I've interviewed Richard Dawkins about this at some of his live events in the United States. I've been the moderator at those, and I've asked him about this because he's as conflicted as I am. And he says that when you think back to, for example, the times of slavery, and you think, how could people possibly have thought that was okay? And then you project yourself into the future and think, surely there are some things that we're doing now that will seem as inconceivable to people in the future as slavery does to us now. And what might those be? I mean, a big one would have to be the wholesale industrial farming of animals. And this is not specifically about eating meat per se, but it's about treating animals purely as pounds of flesh, as kilograms of flesh, and where the only consideration really is getting the price down as low as possible for the consumer at the supermarket. And so cramming them into these huge concentrated animal feeding operations and essentially torturing them for their short, brutal lives before slaughtering them. And the fact that most of us, almost all of us, are complicit in that system is just extraordinary when you actually step back and think about it. And as I was just starting to say, I think that when my kids are my age, it's entirely possible that my daughter could turn around and say to me, wait a second, you were feeding a little baby the flesh of a tortured pig, and you knew what that pig's life had been like, and you were putting that in the mouth of an innocent little, like, what the fuck were you even thinking? So I don't do that, and I probably won't do that. And I think I'm just going to start in small ways by not eating pigs. And I mean, there's a whole interesting conversation that people really should listen to the Paul Shapiro episode of We the People Live, not to keep plugging it, but there's a whole interesting conversation about the varying levels of immorality of eating different types of animals, because there's this weird thing where as people become vegetarians, they will often start by not eating red meat and saying, oh, I only eat I only eat chickens, or I only eat eggs. Paul says, actually, the worst thing you could do morally is eat cage-farmed eggs. Probably worse than actually eating the flesh of a chicken, because the lives of those chickens are just so intolerable. And in terms of eating red meat versus white meat, you got to think about how much of an animal's conscious suffering are you owning in order to feed you for a single meal. So, like, my husband and I had chicken for dinner last night, and we basically demolished an entire small chicken between the two of us. Well, that only gave the pair of us one feed, and we have the kind of moral karma of an entire chicken's, well, actually, in this case, it was a free-range, nice, fancy chicken, which I try to always buy. But assume that chicken had been an industrially farmed chicken. We have the moral karma of that entire life on our hands. Whereas if we'd had a steak, if we'd had a couple of steaks, that might have been, 1/20th of the karma of an animal's brutal and painful life. So I think there are interesting ways of thinking about this. But it's clear to me that certainly in the case of things like sausages and hamburgers and chicken nuggets and all of those things that the way most people consume their meat, most meat is not consumed as a filet mignon steak. Those things are quickly going to be able to be produced without the involvement of an animal's consciousness and without the involvement of animal suffering. And as you say, I think that's going to change the game.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's one of them ones that I really count as a difficult conversation. I tend to lose more people on this topic than anything else. It's this and 9/11 that tends to be the great divide.
It's funny, isn't it? Why do you think that is?
I think it's the meat one specifically. I think it's because we are all part of it. We're all part of the system. I liken this back to religion. So it's a cultural practice eating meat. It's in our advertisements. There's memes about bacon. We reinforce it, and it's almost like I mean, we tell ourselves little religious lies about things surrounding the whole meat production industry. And I think once somebody holds a mirror up, it's a very similar response to telling somebody that their religion's stupid or perhaps God doesn't exist. And I think there's a sort of cognitive process going on there where you feel you have to reflexively defend your own behavior, or maybe you feel like you're under attack when this information comes your way. So I mean, these ways of approaching this conversation with people that work better than going on the offensive. There's some cheese festival in Manchester a couple of weeks ago, and there was a load of vegans that turned up with the cow masks on with big signs saying cheese is murder, getting in people's faces. And I'm thinking, who are you trying to convert here? What are your goals other than to annoy people and make them further be entrenched against veganism?
Well, this comes back to the kind of overarching theme of this episode, I suppose, which is how to have conversations with people, right, without triggering tripwires or further alienating them. There's a useful rule of thumb that I like to bear in mind, which perhaps your listeners would benefit from, which is to think about communication and about the way that we think about things in terms of a kind of an empathic leap, like a leap of imagination that has to do with empathy. So putting yourself in the shoes of the person who you're talking to and trying to think about how that might land, right? So if you're an innocent person going to a cheese festival because you think cheese is one of the great culinary pleasures of life, and someone is screaming at you that cheese is murder, I'm sure that the person who's screaming cheese is murder is entirely convinced that cheese is murder, but how would you make an empathic leap into the shoes of the person who hasn't really thought about it that way and who enjoys cheese in order to have that concept land, right? I mean, the idea that shouting at them is going to be the best way is ludicrous. It's lunacy. I mean, I suppose the pro case might be, well, it's going to jolt them out of their complacency and get them to look into the question further, but it probably won't. Well, it'll probably just make them think that you're crazy. And similarly, the whole concept of animal rights itself, not to mention the whole abortion question that I was talking about before, not to mention the whole question of identity politics and who has standing to talk about cultural issues, is wrapped up in this concept of having an empathic leap. It's almost like meat eaters have not made the empathic leap to what it might be like to not be a Homo sapien.
Yeah.
Right? Because a lot of people just say, well, I like bacon. I mean, I like the taste of it. It's delicious. I'm not going to give that up. Right. But in the same way that people previously did not make the empathic leap into what it might feel like to be a black person who is enslaved, can you imagine that there is something that it feels like to be a pig? Right? It's not the same as what it feels like to be a human, but we absolutely, without a doubt, know that pigs are capable of affection, love, aspirations, preferences, and most importantly, suffering and pain. So there's something going on there that is not just a question of it being an automaton where the lights are switched off. So try to make the empathic leap to what it might feel like to be a dumb, stupid, delicious pig whose life is purely at the service of the fact that you like your bacon for breakfast. And if that has no kind of moral weight with you, if that just doesn't land for you as anything that is remotely relevant into taking into consideration when you're putting the bacon in your face, then that's a conscious decision for you to ignore the welfare of another sentient creature. That's not at least take the first step to try to figure out what it might be like to be in somebody else's shoes. And this comes back. So I think the same principle applies to whether or not a baby has any more rights at 8 months outside of the womb than at 9 months in the womb. The same principle applies as to whether or not people should pile on when I say that using the word nigger is terrible to use in anger. Like, make the empathic leap. Put yourself in my fucking shoes. Like, think about what it might be like to not be you. It's not all about you. Maybe that should be the motto of my whole show. It's not all about you.
Well, it is we the people, isn't it? So
that's right, exactly.
Yeah, excellent, Josh. I've really enjoyed speaking to you. I'm glad we found time for this. We've been trying to arrange it for some time.
Yeah, it's been a long time coming, and I'm glad we found a moment.
It's flown by. Is there anything else you want to point people towards before I let you get back to your day?
Yeah. So there's a new podcast. Well, there's a new radio show that I'll be doing in Australia, which is going to be podcast, which is called Citizen Jury, and that's going to launch in around Easter time, and it's basically we take one big policy issue and we basically get the nation to kind of chime in on it and vote on it and debate on it, and we try to solve the big ethical quandaries of our time. So I don't know whether that will be any good, but if you're interested in me, you might want to look up ABC Radio National Citizen Jury when that comes out. Obviously subscribe to my podcast, #WeThePeople, all one word, live. There are a couple of We the People, so just don't make sure you're not subscribing to some crazy libertarian constitutional podcast.
The racist baby-killing Australian is the one you're after.
Exactly, that's right. Make sure you look for that one. And if you're in Australia, you can hear me on ABC Radio fairly frequently. And there was something else. Oh, that's right. There's another podcast that I do, which is called Out of the Loop, but that's mainly for Australian audiences to fill them in a funny, whimsical way about the stories that they might have missed throughout the week. That's also produced by the ABC. And follow me on Twitter, JOSHZEPPS. I think that's about it.
Oh, brilliant. Thanks, Josh. This has been great.
Stephen, great to talk to you. Thanks, mate.
Thank you for listening to the Godless Spellchecker podcast. The podcast is a one-man operation produced in my spare time away from my day job, and I love making it for you. If you enjoy what you hear, please consider lending some support. The show is entirely listener supported. I don't sell anything, I don't run ads, and given the alternative and unpopular focus of my content, it's very unlikely to find a sponsor. So there are a number of ways you can support and chip in and help improve the show and give me more time to produce more content. You can become a patron supporter and pledge a monetary amount per month or per episode by visiting patreon.com/gspellchecker. If you can't lend monetary support right now, don't worry, there's other ways you can help the podcast too. You can share it on your various social media networks, or take a moment to leave a review wherever you listen to it. Your support is massively appreciated. Thank you. Think we've all learned something here today?